what are waiting lines? Waiting lines occur when someone is waiting for a service, or waiting for something to happen at your company. We obviously can think of these things: waiting at the grocery store, waiting in line for tickets, those sorts of things. But waiting lines can also occur in manufacturing. So, work in process that's waiting to be processed on equipment. And waiting lines, generally speaking, form because of an imbalance between the available capacity and what's being demanded at that moment. And that imbalance occurs typically because of variability in the system. So, a quick example of this would be, when you go into Walmart, people don't arrive at perfectly even intervals. People arrive randomly, almost in clumps. And so, because of the random arrivals, there will be moments where you'll have a lot of waiting at cashiers, and then other moments when cashiers have no work to do. And it's because of that variability. So, in manufacturing, if you have imbalances in machine processing times or imbalances in what employees are able to do, you end up with the same sort of waiting lines. Even if your average capacity is enough capacity, you can still have waiting lines occur. So, when we talk about a waiting line, or a waiting system, we're generally talking about several components of it. You have your customer population who could potentially show up. So, is it, anyone could show up, like at a Walmart store? Or is it a members only club so that your population is limited only to members? Or, if is there some other limitation on the population versus the actual waiting line and receiving the service or being manufactured in the case that it's a manufactured good. When we combine both the waiting line and receiving the service, that is considered the service system that you would consider from a management perspective, strategically designing and managing that system. And then, of course, customers will leave that system when they're done with the service. So when we think about kind of waiting line arrangement options, the two simplest ways of thinking about this are a single line model versus a multi-line model. You've probably seen this in various service settings yourself. So imagine you're at a Walmart store. You've probably seen this multiple line model where you have an individual waiting line that feeds to an individual cashier. But this other model, the single line model, that this typically happens at like banks that go to the next available teller. You might see it at like ticket counters, and other types of like theme parks will use a single line model. The single line model is actually a much more efficient model of getting people through the system faster. And the reason why is if everyone lines up in a single waiting line and feeds to the next available person, then any delay at one of the cashiers or service providers doesn't delay the whole line. Instead, it just delays that single person, but the line continues to move to the next available cashier. Whereas in a multi-line model, if you have a delay with the person in front of you in line, you're stuck. And so, if you want to design the most efficient waiting line that will get people through the system faster, you want a single line model. So, you might be asking, why wouldn't we always use the single line model? And the answer to that question has a lot to do with psychology. People sometimes will see the large waiting line and assume it's going to take forever and leave the service setting instead of waiting. And because of that psychology, managers will sometimes break up the waiting lines to make the wait appear shorter. But the irony of it all is you actually get through the system faster in the single line model. So if you're designing for time, try to use that single line structure. We can also have different phases of services that include waiting. So, for example, a single channel, single phase. People come in, they go to a single facility and are served, and then the service is over. In a single channel, multiple phase, you would go into the facility, have some level of service, but you need additional processing at a different facility. So I think about this like going to the doctor's office. You go to the doctor's office, you wait in the waiting room, then you get your blood pressure checked, and then you have kind of to wait again before you see the doctor. That's a multiple phase sort of arrangement. You can also have a single channel or multi-channel single phase where you're feeding people to the right type of service. Maybe there's different service options, the right type of service, and then they're done. And then the most complicated version is a multi-channel, multi-phase, where you're feeding to the right initial service, but then they can feed further into a secondary service as well. So when we think about how do we manage these as managers, we're thinking both, how are people in my service facility? How much service do they need? Is it just a single employee or system that gets someone through this process? Or are there multiple touch points that I need to design for? And I can even design individual waiting lines for every single individual thing. That is the most complicated way of managing waiting lines. We also have to think about some of the, I guess, expectations of waiting lines. So most people expect first come, first serve. If I'm, the second in line at the grocery store checkout, I'm expecting to be checked out second. So first come first serve is this expectation that the first person in the line is served first, the next person in the line is served next, and so on and so forth. It's considered the most fair of the waiting line priority rules. But you have some other ones that make sense depending on the setting of the waiting line. Earliest due date is commonly used in what I would call back office processes. So if you are dealing with whether it's manufacturing waiting lines or just paperwork that is waiting on processing, you might prioritize that based on what is due first. So earliest due date. I usually tell my students that they probably do this a lot by prioritizing their homework based on due date, not necessarily what they were assigned first. But then you can also prioritize based on shortest processing time. And the final option is preemptive discipline, which is when kind of society accepts that it's okay that someone skips the line. So a good example of this is in an emergency room, healthcare setting. Let's say you've been waiting there for 2 hours because you broke your arm, and you're waiting to receive service for your broken arm. But then a traumatic, car accident just happened and that person gets wheeled right in ahead of you. That sort of preemptive discipline is accepted by society as the most urgent cases go first. But in other settings, that would not be true. First comes, first serve would be more expected. So there are some psychological components of waiting lines to keep in mind, particularly for managers trying to help kind of set customer expectations to manage customer satisfaction levels. So, these days everyone has their phone, so they're easily distracted. But there are some rules when it comes to the psychology of waiting. If my time is occupied, it doesn't feel as long. If I have something to do, whether it's a TV that I can watch in the waiting room, certainly my phone can keep me distracted, but occupied time feels shorter. It's why if I'm waiting around and I'm surrounded by my friends, it doesn't seem so bad compared to waiting by myself. Um, in process waiting feels shorter. So goes back to the example that I gave where you go to the doctor's office and they take your blood pressure and then you kind of wait again to see the doctor. If you feel like you've started in that process, it doesn't feel as long of a wait. So another example of this would be, having people fill out paperwork while they're waiting, fill out a survey while they're waiting, getting information from them while they're waiting. That makes the wait feel like they've already started the process, so it doesn't feel so bad. A lack of information feels longer, and this is where managers can really take note. You want to provide estimates of wait time where possible. So, can you tell them it'll be 20 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour? You need to set those expectations. And in fact, you want to make sure you can set expectations, but also maybe explain why. This is like, if you think about you're waiting on your flight at the airport and the flight is delayed. If you have some information on why the flight is delayed, you're going to feel a little bit better about it, even if you're irritated by the wait. But a complete lack of information is the worst option, and that feels the worst to customers as well. So you want to both set expectations and provide information where possible. And then, of course, unfair waits seem longer. And that's certainly true. There's a famous MIT experiment where a professor took his graduate students to a long ticket line, waiting for a famous person's concert tickets to go on sale. And he had the graduate students randomly cut in line. And they found that people ahead of the line cutter were just as pissed off as the people behind the line cutter, even though the people ahead of the line cutter didn't actually suffer, extra waiting time. They just didn't like the fairness or the unfairness of someone cutting in line. They actually had to stop this experiment because people were getting angry, borderline violent with the graduate students. So they stopped the experiment. But I think that's really interesting psychology when it comes to perception of weight and fairness. We also know that the more valuable the product or service, the longer people are willing to wait for it. That's not a surprise. Um, you feel like you're waiting longer if you're by yourself, or if you're uncomfortable, if it's too hot or too cold, or if you have to stand instead of sit. So managers can actually do something about that. Is the temperature comfortable? Are there sitting options? Think about these things when you're designing your waiting spaces. And expectations of waiting time strongly impact customer satisfaction. So if I know I'm going to wait on something and I'm expecting it to be 30 minutes and it's actually 30 minutes, I'm not unhappy. Like I expected it, it happened, I'm not unhappy. If I don't expect to wait at all and I wait 30 minutes, I'm irritated. And if I expected to wait an hour and I only waited 30 minutes, I'm actually thrilled. So expectations have a very strong link to the level of satisfaction that I have. So managers need to manage those expectations very deliberately. And of course, we know theme parks that are just known for this. Disney is known for designing waits. They actually have waiting line engineers that design waiting lines and waiting spaces to account for all of these psychological components. And you even see this further in the new apps that are being offered by Disney and Universal and a lot of the other major theme parks that give you information like forecasted wait times, where you can join a wait list or check in. You can mobile order. So all of this gives you is expectation setting, but it's also giving you information about what weights will be. So hopefully this was useful and you learned something about waiting line management. See you next time.